President expanded powers, wars, emergencies, and media have contributed. Other branches checking or not checking. When you're ready, you may begin.
Well, there has been no linear
Stop.
growth. That was embarrassing.
Are you
Okay.
checking, Mr. Clerk?
No, that's one of your jobs. I time myself. Some of you guys time.
All right.
Okay,
got
you
it.
guys are ready. Okay.
Got it.
When you're ready, you may begin.
Well, there has been no linear growth to the constitutional powers of the executive. There has been an expansion of executive responsibilities. The vesting and take care clauses grant inherent powers that allow the president to adopt unforeseen responsibilities in situations calling for responsive and effective executive execution beyond the ability of legislation or a split Congress. The most influential executives embody this responsive energy, taking advantage of opportunities to exercise these powers, often through executive orders. These orders carry quasi-legislative functions to clarify how pre-existing laws are to operate, such as President Obama's recent order on immigration reform. These powers give executive discretion to the president to determine how vigorously to enforce certain laws or rulings. President Dwight Eisenhower issued an order to forcefully integrate schools to carry out the ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. Meanwhile, President Ronald Reagan did little to enforce federal abortion laws during his presidency. These executive orders have expanded presidential responsibilities as they need to faithfully and responsibly expedite legislation.
Wars and emergency create a political or economic environment calling for an efficient and responsive execution by a president, as opposed to a slow, deliberative, or split legislature. The framers were aware of this from the Revolutionary War, where under the Articles of Confederation, George Washington's army was consistently slowed down by having to wait for congressional approval and funding for basic military actions. The inefficiency of the Articles made many advocate for a more functional, energetic executive to respond to such situations. For example, President Franklin Roosevelt, when faced with crises like the Great Depression and World War II, was able to issue 3,522 executive orders over his presidency to advance his policies.
Presidents have the ability to respond to emergencies much more efficiently than deliberative legislatures, which became especially emphasized during the nuclear age. President Kennedy was able to use his emergency powers to rapidly resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis. This presidential efficiency remains true today with the current Ebola crisis, where President Obama issued an order appointing an Ebola czar to oversee federal coordination in a much more efficient way than Congress could. Quick executive action against crises posing national security or health threats is essential to both public safety and public assurance that the nation is not in danger.
Social media and television have also offered a medium for expanding presidential influence. As the figurehead of American government, the president has publicity to communicate with more American demographics through modern fireside chats. Presidents have increasingly appeared on talk and radio shows to further spread their messages. In March, President Obama did an interview with comedian Zach Galifianakis to promote the Affordable Care Act to attract a younger audience. Congress has been reactionary in response to the expansion of presidential authority when public opinion has been in their favor. On November 23rd, the House of Representatives filed a suit against President Obama because they believe that he overstepped his power in unilaterally acting to waive deadlines and pay insurance companies under the Affordable Care Act without approval from Congress. The 1973 War Powers Resolution was passed in reaction to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, an attempt to regain congressional power as outlined in Article 1, Section 8. However, this resolution has only been enacted twice. While Congress has more constitutionally enumerated powers than the executive, when they are not actively using them, they defer many of these responsibilities to the executive.
The Supreme Court's crisis jurisprudence has shown a pattern of oscillation towards the presidential power. During the Korean War, President Truman issued Executive Order Number 10340 in 1952, taking control of the nation's steel mills in order to avoid a strike by the United Steelworkers of America. As a result, Justice Robert Jackson's concurrence from the case of Youngstown Sheet and Tube Corporation versus Sawyer created red, yellow, and green guidelines for presidential actions.
Other presidents, such as George W. Bush, have strongly implemented the unitary executive theory, which embodies the opening of Article 2, allowing all of the executive power to be placed in the hands of the president. Specifically, President Bush used this theory to justify this executive's ability over the use of military force, the detention and interrogation of enemy combatants, extraordinary rendition, and intelligence gathering. However, as shown in the 2006 case of Boumediene v. Bush, the court is more likely to closely examine the constitutionality of presidential actions after the public safety has been assured. Thank you.
You've been spending a bit of time on the executive order. The U.S. Constitution was written purposely with this idea of separation of powers to keep things balanced, to prevent for any one branch from becoming tyrannical in any way. In your opinion, is this an appropriate, this bit more vigorous executive power appropriate, or is this allowing for the president to do more than just be an executive, but to really take on more legislative authority?
Article 2 is it doesn't enumerate the power of the executive to actually issue specifically executive orders, but through different interpretations of the Constitution, and as Congress may not be acting on certain issues, the president, many presidents, not just President Obama, but President Roosevelt, President Truman, many others have had to take their authority in order to issue these executive orders and make sure that something is getting done with certain issues.
So you feel that they had to, that this keeps things in a proper balance?
I think they had to, yes, in order to make sure that something was getting done and issues were being addressed that maybe Congress couldn't address in a given amount of time, or they just didn't get to. I think there are many different instances for different issues.
Executive orders aren't specifically ever stated in the Constitution, they're simply implied. So you can interpret them two different ways. And one way you can say an executive order is just the president taking any action. Any sort of step he would do would be considered an executive order. So in that sense, there would be no overstepping of bounds. But on another sense, as presidents have shown, executive orders can be taken a lot more differently, and they can be used in a different way, such as President Obama taking steps on immigration currently, and how the legislature is challenging his views and maybe going to say they aren't constitutional. So if you look at them either way, in one way, yes, they can overstep their bounds, but in another, it's just them doing basically anything.
What I hear the justification for executive orders, though, is that, well, Congress is slow and deliberative, and therefore we need executive orders to get in and get stuff done. But wasn't that the founders' intention? Didn't they want slow, deliberative legislative branch to slow things down, to check the government as a whole, and to allow issues to be aired and debated rather than, sort of shoot from the hip decisions?
The the framers definitely wanted the Congress, the legislative branch in general, to be slower so there weren't unconstitutional laws being enacted that would take away the rights of the people. Where that comes in with relationship to the executive is I think it's a very gray area because of the fact that when there are wars and emergencies such as Ebola, there has to be a quicker action to take place, which is why Article 2 vests all the executive power to be placed in the hands of the executive, allowing the executive to take action in order to ensure the safety of the country.
Slow and deliberative is definitely something that's needed and necessary, but also there has to be some sort of balance between someone having a way to kind of almost check that power. So I think it's very important for the president to be able to make an executive order in times such as congressional gridlock, where the government could be shut down. That's a perfect example of how the president could step in and take action and prevent things from being shut down, as we've seen in the past.
So how do you limit presidential power then, if they can just at any time decide, hey, I think this is such a serious issue, I need to issue an order now?
So that not originally, but one of the instances where that came up was in the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Corporation versus Sawyer, where President Truman issued an executive order to nationalize the steel mills. So from that, Justice Jackson his concurrence created a relationship between Congress and the law and the president. So if Congress is right on, go president, you can do that, it's okay. If they're weary, then the president might still take action. And then if Congress is very against it, then that's kind of a huge no-no for the president, which if he takes action, there can be later cases that come in to reverse that executive order and say that it was unconstitutional.
I'm gonna change scope a little bit. One of the controversial issues besides executive orders is the use of presidential signing statements, as well as the want for presidents to have line item vetoes. My question is, what is a presidential signing statement? What is a line item veto, and why do they raise so much controversy for a president?
A line item veto is the power of the president to veto a certain section of a bill. So instead of vetoing the whole thing, they can take out certain sections within that bill and say this part isn't good, but I like the rest of it, or something like that. That's a very controversial issue because the president can take out parts that might be essential to the bill in order for it to be constitutional, and that the line item veto gives the executive too much power that could later allow an unconstitutional bill or law to be passed.
Continue, you guys, an answer. I know.
And then
Hang on, Mary Alice, signing statement?
I
Go ahead, answer signing statement, Sophie. Sophia.
so,
Sophia, sorry.
so I believe a signing statement is when the president just approves.
We'll talk about it.
Okay, I'm like, I'm gonna stop there.
Go ahead, feedback.
Good job. I realize it sounded like maybe you had to jumble your presentation to cover for an absentee member.